Welcome everybody. My name is Rachel O'Brien and I work on RSA's transitions projects, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. Welcome to tonight's RSA lecture, Creating a Rehabilitation Culture. We're delighted to see so many of you here, and for most of you involved in the business of looking at the future of prisons and justice services, I think you'll agree that Professor Shad Maroon is a bit of a hero. Certainly is of mine. We're delighted to have him here. But before I introduce Shad, I want to take up a few minutes of your time to talk about the wider context that this lecture takes place in. As some of you will know, justice services are currently undergoing the most radical changes that have been seen for some decades. And certainly what the prisons say to us is big changes have happened, but everything's changing all at once. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but the government's transforming rehabilitation agenda ushers in significant changes, not just to prisons, but also to probation and resettlement services. And that includes opening up what was the probation services to the market, or a large part of it. Whether one agrees with these changes or not, they look set to happen, and they'll happen fast. The timetable is for October 2015. And they come at a time when there's less public money to go round. So we find ourselves in a position of trying to do more, transform rehabilitation, and there's genuine, I think, desire to make change with less. And that raises the issue of, well, what does rehabilitation mean? We better know what it is we're trying to do. So that's the context for this lecture, but it's also the context of the RSA Transitions project, which I've been working on for about 2 years. And which is a major rehabilitation project that's taking place in East Yorkshire. I moved there about a year ago, which I think shows huge commitment. As much as I love East Yorkshire, I miss London. But I want to talk about it really for 2 reasons, not to just plug the project, which I'm quite happy to do. But first, I want to sort of really say a little bit about the fellowship. And I think Transition is an example of the inspiration that can be the RSA Fellowship. In 2011, a small group of fellows got together to produce a small pamphlet called Transitions. And it was small, but it had a big vision of the future of prisons. And the core question they asked was whether some of the Ministry of Justice's assets, land adjacent to prisons, buildings, old farms that were lying fallow, could be used more productively in easing prisoners' transition to the community. Could creating transitions parks provide a vital space next door to prisons to think and work alongside prisons, helping to drive innovation, social enterprise and work? Could they increase capacity, help expand networks and join up services? And most of all, could they support rehabilitation and help to reduce reoffending? So that was the idea. And as a direct result of that bit of work, since 2012, the RSA has been working closely, and when I say closely, it's pretty much one team at the moment, with staff, prisoners at H&P Humber, with the aim of developing a site that's next door to the prisons, 45 acres, with a lovely manor house and an old farm, that largely has been sitting there unused for 10 years, which is a travesty in my book. Ed Cornell, I can't see him because I'm sort of blanking everyone out, the prison governor there, and also an RSA fellow, is in the room somewhere. And we're really grateful to him and his team and his residents for welcoming us and working with us at H&P Humber. I'm also going to embarrass some other fellows who are also in the room, who were those original Gang of 4, Gang of 5, Gang of 6, I can't remember, who helped us develop the idea, and some of them have continued to work with us as advisors, experts and friends, if critical friends at times. We've just completed our study and the final report will be published shortly, and anyone that's interested, let me know and we can make sure you get a copy. And this will outline our plans for H&P Humber, but I think the important thing, like most of RSA's best projects, Transitions aims to be replicable and provide learning that can be exported elsewhere. And this brings me to the second reason I wanted to talk about Transitions. Having undertaken a year's research and consultation in Humber, our central argument is that prisons cannot make further inroads to reducing reoffending without developing a deeper and shared understanding of rehabilitation culture. When we say deeper, we mean understanding what this means for the individual. And we rarely ask the individual, or not enough. that go through the justice system, what needs to change, take place within them. We argue that in addressing someone's needs and where they are on that rehabilitation journey, far more attention needs to be given to their networks and relationships. We know all those that work in criminal justice talk about 7 pathways. We argue that we need to understand far more what it is that helps people in terms of the relationships, links, information and so on that they have. And of course they're very isolated within the prison system. And when we say shared, we mean that prisons and justice services need to become more embedded within their local communities and economies. All of this sounds really obvious, but actually when you go into prisons sometimes, some of the work, for example, doesn't match the economy outside, so we need to look at that. They need to be able to draw on the potential assets out there, including employers, communities and ex-offenders, including us. Increasing rehabilitation, one of our most stubborn challenges that has not shifted dramatically, not through want of trying, requires an equally robust and social response. Our aim is not to criticise from the outside, but to argue that the transition model can provide the necessary space, freedoms and partnerships that prisons need. And we're not there yet. In the next stage of the project, we'll work with our evaluation partners, HMP Humber, prisoners, families and staff, to explore the very idea of rehabilitation culture. But while we may have an intuitive idea of what this means, can we recognise it when we see it? Can we measure it? Can we strengthen it? And most importantly, for people like Ed Cornell here, can we operationalise it? I'm hoping that what we will hear today will help to answer some of these questions. But now to Shad. Professor Shad Maruna is a criminologist at the School of Law and Queen's University, Belfast, whose interests include assistance from crime, offender reintegration, penal reform and narrative methodology. Prior to moving to Queen's in 2005, Shad was a lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the State University at New York and Albany. His book, Making Good, How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives, was named the Outstanding Contribution to Criminology by the American Society of Criminology in 2001, which went on to name his Distinguished New Scholar in Corrections and Sentencing in 2004. He's a member of the Correctional Services Accreditation Panel at NOMS, and hot off the press, and you're the first people to hear this, see if I can read my own writing, he's just been, as of Friday, appointed Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University in New York. So please welcome Shad Maruna.
Thanks very much. That is an extremely kind introduction, and it turns out that we feel the exact same way about each other, myself and the RSA. Not just that you're my heroes as well as the other way around, but I also think the RSA, all of you, are great criminologists. Basically, I'm here because I've read the Transitions report from 2011, and I've read, and I'm not sure if it's been launched yet, the sequel to that report, the Building a Rehabilitation Culture report. And I'm convinced that not only is the RSA writing some of the most interesting things about rehabilitation anywhere, but they're also doing it. And criminology is both theory and action, and that knowing and also doing and then learning some more is precisely how criminology is done. And I think the RSA is doing it in a very exciting way. So that's why I'm here. I'm also especially enamored with this movement away from thinking about rehabilitation as kind of the next magic bullet to come around. And this will be something that I'm going to talk about here, but to give away some of my punchline, I think too often we think of rehabilitation as this kind of reversal of everything that's going to come in this kind of magic bullet. Over and over again, we're disappointed when we find out that magic bullet doesn't actually change, give us the results that we're looking for. And what we're seeing is, of course, no single factor is going to undermine an overarching culture, the kind of overarching climate and institutional effects that you see so strongly in Alison Liebling's great research at the University of Cambridge, and I'm glad to see Alison here today, that it's not a matter of introducing a single program or a single project. We need to change the entire barrel. The entire culture needs to change if we want to see the kind of changes we should see. Crime, as we know, I've done something wrong. Crime, as we know, is nothing if not a social phenomenon, and there's kind of no more key Enlightenment understanding than that. This is from Wilkinson's great book, The Spirit Level, and simply showing the strong correlation between unequal societies and high incarceration rates. The more unequal the society, the higher the incarceration rate. And this is something we've known for a long time. The strong correlation between disadvantage and crime can be seen at every level, the individual level, the community level, the macro level as well. And again, this is straight out of Enlightenment thinking, so Rousseau, Voltaire, and the like. The key insight that has yet to be incorporated, I think, into our criminal justice thinking in a substantial way. But that is, if crime is a social phenomenon, then surely our response to crime, and rehabilitation being our primary response, needs to also be a social response. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the RSA's approach. And it's also exciting to be in such an Enlightenment era organization like the RSA talking about this, and this got me thinking I should riff on this notion of enlightenment, so I changed my title ever so slightly, creating an enlightened rehabilitation culture. The Enlightenment, in many ways, never came to criminal justice. Like the RSA, the field of criminology was born in the Enlightenment, and it also is an inherently an Enlightenment exercise and enterprise. Yet we work in a sort of surreal parallel universe where the work that we do largely doesn't affect, it largely has no impact on, and for reasons that go two ways, the broader workings of the criminal justice system. The Institute director at Cambridge, Lawrence Sherman, recently said justice still remains largely unenlightened, and I think he's right about that. Now, of course, this isn't to say the Enlightenment didn't impact criminal justice. We had, of course, Beccaria, and in many ways he's been called the father of criminology, the father of penology. And one could ask, well, didn't his classic of Crimes and Punishment in 1764 essentially do away with the barbarian forms of justice from the Middle Ages and herald a new enlightened criminal justice system? That's how, of course, we're taught it in textbooks and introductory lectures to criminology. But there's little evidence that that's actually true. There's no question that Beccaria was enormously influential. It was a hugely influential book at the time that he wrote it. He was immediately lauded by the sovereign powers at the time. And that influence has never really died since then. Not that anyone still reads Beccaria's original work, but we've essentially been living with Beccaria's justice system since 1764 in many ways. It's not an exaggeration to regard Beccaria's work as of primary importance of penal reform for the last 2 centuries. Yet Beccaria was a deeply conservative figure who sought to create a criminological system which evaded the difficult questions, the revolutionary questions that were inherent in Enlightenment thought. Essentially, his legacy to the field of criminology, but more importantly to criminal justice systems around the world, was to create the massive bureaucracy that we currently have. Essentially, despite his reputation as a great reformer, Beccaria basically developed a modest, derivative, status quo preserving carve-up of Enlightenment justice that basically preserve the sovereign's right to punish excessively through a vacillation between utilitarian deterrence theory and a bit of non-limiting retributivism thrown in. Yes, he was successful in reforming the practice of torture, although not corporal punishment, which he advocated in the book. He did have an impact on the death penalty and judicial discretion, but he was very much in favor of the use of punishment and imprisonment in particular, and instead put the power of a punishment into the hands of the state in such a way that nearly guaranteed that punishments would increase, not decrease, in the name of the common good. And of course, this has been the legacy. This is Graham Newman writing about Beccaria's legacy. He says, and it is a self-indulgent assumption to believe that the changes brought by the Enlightenment are in any way morally better or more liberal than the period before it. It is impossible to tell whether prison, as it is massively used today, is a milder punishment than various corporal punishments, even the death penalty, that were used in the 18th century. And it is even less possible to guess whether more or fewer people are punished today than yesterday. So this is the challenge. Instead, the justice system we have today, evidenced by the fact that we use some of the same buildings, like Pentonville Prison, envisioned by Bentham, Beccaria's protege, and others, is still largely the same as it's been for 200 years. We're caught in a kind of Beccarian cycle, I would argue, and I'll develop that argument in a moment. This isn't to say, and the RSA is clear about this in their reports, that innovative, important rehabilitative work, forward-thinking, enlightenment thinking doesn't go on inside the walls of our prisons today. Of course it does. I wouldn't be here if it doesn't. It keeps me going at the work that I do. But the work is patchy, it's piecemeal, it's unsupported, it's fragile, and most importantly, it's often hidden from wider views, in many ways purposefully so. To do good work, to do rehabilitation work, we think it has to be done out of the sight of the community, of the wider public, and in particular, of course, the tabloid media, for fear that it will be displeasing to these masters, which is hugely ironic. And what's worse is it didn't have to be like this. During the Enlightenment, there were a number of other voices besides Beccaria's that were taking the same source material, Hume and Rousseau and Voltaire, Locke and the like, and making an entirely different argument about what justice should look like. William Godwin, the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft and father of Mary Shelley, argued, for instance, that the deterrence-based arguments in Beccaria's work could justify the most execrable tyrannies. He argued that crime was a product of unjust societies, and therefore to conceive that compulsion and punishment are the proper means of reformation is the sentiment of a barbarian. Now, had Godwin's vision, or Hume's or Rousseau's, become the dominant Enlightenment vision of justice, who knows how things might have changed. So there is a chance, a moment, I think, an opportunity for a new Enlightenment thinking around justice, an alternative Enlightenment, maybe a true Enlightenment vision of what justice could and should be. And I'm encouraged in that sense by the sheer numbers here today. I also got a list of all the people who are here in this room, and it's a remarkable list. There's people here from User Voice, the Forgiveness Project, Big Society Capital, Transform Justice, the New Bridge Foundation, the Cabinet Office. And it's hard to not see a list like this, see a room like this, and not be excited that we're on the precipice, perhaps, a moment here in the UK, and indeed elsewhere, including the United States, where there's an opportunity for a new kind of thinking around rehabilitation, a new way of conceiving of enlightened criminal justice. But then again, we have to be careful about this thinking. As a criminologist who studies rehabilitation, I admit to finding myself awfully excited and somewhat confused by the announcement 3 or 4 years ago now of Ken Clark's rehabilitation revolution. And now, of course, we're in a moment of transforming rehabilitation. Rehabilitation as a concept and every criminologist was taught this, was officially deemed dead as recently as the 1970s. This was the moment of justice model thinking in the UK and the US and elsewhere, but also it was a time of nothing works. The idea that treatment and training has had its day and should be replaced, or that since we know that custodial sentences will not achieve rehabilitation, rehabilitation should no longer be an aim which sentencers have in mind when sending people to prison. In criminology, we're taught this story that rehabilitation was killed by a study done by a researcher named Martinson back in the 1970s. It was replicated in the UK by Stephen Brodie in his review. But Martinson and his colleagues in the 1970s were asked to review all of the available evidence on rehabilitation research, and in doing so, they came to the conclusion, put more eloquently at times by Martinson, that we know very little about what works, which came to be known as the conclusion that nothing works in rehabilitation. And this became a very important and landmark sort of study. Martinson did the rounds of news programs and the like. The press was enamored by this study, and of course criminologists hated the finding. To many, Martinson became a kind of hate figure, and many of us spent a number of decades trying to disprove this notion that nothing works, and created the what works movement, which eventually changed from the question mark to the exclamation point when we decided that we know what works in reforming offenders. Of course, the truth is that Martinson's research didn't cause the end of the rehabilitative ideal. Martinson was in the right place or the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps. He caught a much wider wave, something that was going on in the public. The great David Garland says that this account that penal change, the decline of the rehabilitation ideal, was caused by the criminal justice systems of the day waking up and realizing that rehabilitation didn't work. He says is a modern version of the fairy story of Enlightenment reform, and again that theme is back. Garland says the wave that Martinson caught was something he calls late modernity, and he tells a complicated story in the book about what was really going on in the 1970s that led to this wider change. But by the 1980s, we were getting books with titles like The Decline of the Rehabilitative Ideal, and one of my favorite quotes from the great criminologist Richard Korn: "No one but an academic simpleton would even use the word rehabilitation without apprehension." Well, look what's back. The idea of rehabilitation is back, not just back, but back in the form of a revolution. So reports of rehabilitation death have been greatly exaggerated. And even if, and maybe especially if, this is rhetoric, that it was just a press release, this notion of the rehabilitation revolution, it makes it all the more puzzling why and how we got back to this place where this once dirty word, a word that only an academic simpleton would use, is suddenly being used in headlines and press releases. And again, not just in the United Kingdom. The great state of California that once went to the trouble of removing the word rehabilitation from its penal code in the 1970s, changed its Department of Corrections to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, just to reiterate and make sure everyone gets that theme in the work that it's doing. So what's going on here? I call this the English patient question. This is a reference to my viewing of this film that came out a few years ago. This is a film about a guy on his deathbed that won some awards. I went to see the film in a theater with a friend of mine, and I just remember thinking to myself, how long is this going to last? And my friend must have been thinking the same thing, because about 4 or 5 hours into the film, she just blurts out, "Just bloody die already," which got the only applause of the film that